Part 1 of proving Jesus existed. So before we actually start off with facts and evidence, we have to get one thing clear. To prove Jesus existed, we need to look at historical facts, dates, and people. So basically, we need to use history to prove that Jesus was a real person. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because many uneducated skeptics will immediately say that you cannot trust certain documents or certain events because they happened such a long time ago. Well, guess what? That's what history is, the records of things that happened a long time ago. So if you're going to be a logical person and say that we can't trust any historical facts about Jesus, then it means you can't trust any of history at all, because the same arguments you use against Jesus can be used for anything. For example, I can say that George Washington never existed, and now you might argue by bringing up eyewitness accounts and historical records which prove that he actually existed. And guess what? That's the same thing for Jesus. If you say that Jesus never existed, I can also bring up eyewitness accounts to back me up. And I'll be talking about those eyewitness testimonies in part 2, so please go check that out. Part 2 of proving Jesus existed. In part 1, I talked about how exactly I'd be proving Jesus existed, and I brought the topic of eyewitness testimonies, which is what I'll be talking about in this video. So the main eyewitness accounts we have are from the disciples and apostles, who were the closest people to Jesus on earth, and these people documented the life of Jesus in the 4 books we know today as the Gospels. There are also non-biblical sources as well, from the Jewish historian Josephus and the Roman historian Tacitus. And keep in mind that the early Jews and Romans were the worst enemies of Jesus, but even they didn't say that Jesus never existed. You can read a lot of Tacitus writings about Jesus in the works Annals and Histories. What's interesting about Tacitus is that he talks about Jesus and his followers in a very derogatory way, but he still acknowledges that he was a real person, because it would just been stupid to say Jesus never existed. You can even read Lucian's work and see that he makes fun of Christians for worshipping Jesus as he was crucified. So we know there is non-biblical and biblical eyewitness testimonies, but what if these accounts are made up? I'll explain that in part 3, so make sure to go check that out. Part 3 of proving Jesus existed. In part 2, I went over the eyewitness accounts and the non-biblical sources of Jesus Christ, but many people may argue that the sources are made up. As I've already gone over in part 1, questioning historical data about Jesus is problematic. This is because you'll have to do the same level of investigation on every single event. So we know that these non-biblical sources are actually credible, but what about the biblical sources? They could have been made up, right? Well, first of all, the writers would have no intention to lie about what had happened. This is because the gospel writers suffered such horrible deaths for their faith, such as being stoned, beheaded, and even skinned alive. So they actually had no motivation to make up a lie. Some people claim that these gospels are not written by the people who they claim to have, but this doesn't really make any sense. The first gospel is called Matthew. Now, Matthew was a tax collector, a person who was very hated. He wasn't a popular disciple, so why would someone use his name to write a fake gospel? Now, if you look at the actual fake gospels, they have names of popular people like Philip, Mary, and Peter. So if it was fake, the choice of names wouldn't really make that much sense for Matthew. In part 4, I'll talk about the Q, so go check it out. Part 4 of proving Jesus existed. In part 3, I talked about the authors of the biblical manuscripts and explained how the biblical sources of Jesus could not have been made up. In this part, I'll be talking about the Q. The Q is used by historians to refer to the German word Quelle, which means source. Because of some similarities, some people say that Matthew and Luke used Mark's gospel and a mystery Q, or a mystery source, to write their own gospels. Well, first of all, we have to understand that all the Gospels contain the teachings of Jesus, so similarities show that the Gospels had accurately recorded Jesus' teachings, not that they copied each other. And even if they cross-reference some of the events, that doesn't make it lose its credibility. In fact, it increases it. Any good journalist knows that they need multiple sources to cross-reference before releasing a story. They usually cross-reference with eyewitnesses and others who recorded the information as well. This was the same for the Gospel writers. But when were the Gospels written? If they were written hundreds of years later, don't they lose credibility? Well, the thing is, the Gospels weren't written hundreds of years later, and I'll explain why in part 5. Part 5 of proving Jesus existed. In part 4, I talked about the mystery of the Quelle and went over the conspiracy theory that the Gospel writers completely copied each other for the Gospels. In this part, I'll be talking about the time frame of the Gospels. Many uneducated and ignorant people make crazy claims that the Gospels were written hundreds of years after Jesus Christ by some dude named King James. But for anyone who has a basic historical understanding, they know that the Gospels were written within a reasonable time of Jesus' ascension. Jesus ascended in about 29 AD, Mark was written in about AD 66, Matthew and Luke in about AD 85, and John in about AD 90. Now, these are incredibly close to when Jesus was actually crucified. And keep in mind, secular historians also record the crucifixion, so don't even try saying that never happened. Now you might be wondering why they didn't write down their accounts right away. Well, the thing is, the disciples' main focus was not to write down the last 3 years of their life, but to instead share the gospel message first, because that was Jesus' last commandment to them. That explains why they took so long to actually write everything down. Check out part 6 to learn about the intention test. Part 6 of proving Jesus existed. In part 5 I explained the time frames of the Gospels and I explained how they were written in a reasonable time. In this part I'll be going over the intention test. The intention test is used to see whether it was actually the intention of the Gospel writers to accurately preserve history and record what happened. Well, Luke chapter 1 is of Luke telling the reader, a man named Theophilus, that he has carefully investigated all of the information and got everything from multiple eyewitnesses, proving that it was a primary source. Luke tells us that he did this so that we may know all the information is certainly true. So we definitely know it was a priority for Luke to preserve history and it was definitely his intention. And because Mark and Matthew have a similar genre to Luke, we know that they must have also had similar intent to preserve history. And as for John, he says in John 20:31 that his intent in writing down his time with Jesus was so that the audience may read and believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. So of course there's intent for all the Gospel writers. And keep in mind that the Gospel writers make specific historical references such as landmarks that used to exist there and refer to specific people such as Pontius Pilate. In part 7 I'll be going over the ability test, so go check that out. Part 7 of proving Jesus existed. In part 6 I explained the intention test and explained how the Gospel writers had the intention of accurately preserving history. In this part I'll be going over the ability test. This test is to see whether the Gospel writers had the ability to reliably record history many years after the real event. The earliest Gospel was written 30 years after Jesus' ascension. Now this seems like a long time, but we have to understand the time, culture, and place where the events had happened. This is a very oral culture in the early 1st century. There were no computers or printing presses, so the majority of information passing happened through words and the mouth. This also meant that they were able to accurately memorize huge pieces of information. For example, from a young age, kids were taught to memorize the entire Torah. But some skeptics may use the telephone game as an analogy to share how this couldn't work. In the game, you had to quickly whisper a message into the other person's ear and you have to go all the way around in a circle. And in the end, usually the message is completely different from how it started off. This isn't a really good analogy because in the game you have to quickly hear and speak without getting to hear a second time. But in the 1st century, information would have been carefully monitored, so you wouldn't only hear it once. In part 8, I'll explain what the character test is, so please go check. Part 8 of proving Jesus existed. In part 7 I explained the ability test and showed how the Gospel writers had the ability to precisely remember information for many years before writing it down. And also keep in mind that before they wrote it down they were orally preaching the Gospel message to people. In this part I'll be talking about the character test. This test is to see whether the Gospel writers had good morals in writing the Gospels. Well, I already used John 20:31 and it showed that John had a good moral intention to write down history. And considering Jesus was the best moral example, it is very unlikely that his followers were dishonest. Also, these writers and followers died horrible deaths for their writings and faith. Many were stoned, crucified, beheaded, and even skinned alive. Now, it wouldn't really make sense for someone to dedicate their entire life to something they knew that was a lie, and then die for it. This isn't very logical considering that they were eloquent speakers who were able to convert so many people to Christianity. So we know that they had a good character in writing the Gospels. In part 9 I'll be talking about the consistency test, so please go check that out. Part 9 of proving Jesus existed. For the last few parts I've been going over certain tests to see if the Gospels passed them. And if the Gospels pass these tests then it means that it is true, meaning that Jesus truly existed. In this part I'll be talking about the consistency test. Do the Gospels fit well with each other or do they contradict? This question arises because all of the Gospels are talking about Jesus' story but they're not the exact same. Well, first of all, if the Gospels were exactly word for word the same, then the skeptics would take the chance and accuse the writers of plagiarism. So these differences, not necessarily contradictions, are actually in favor of the Gospels. And there's no contradictions in the Bible, but if you think there is, there's a nice YouTube channel called Inspiring Philosophy that goes over these so-called contradictions, which I recommend you check out. And take news channels for example. Sometimes they don't have the exact same details, but the overall message is the same thing. That is if they have multiple eyewitness sources. And the Gospels do have the same overall message, passing the consistency test. Check out part 10 in which I'll go over the bias test. Part 10 of proving Jesus existed. In part 9 I explained how the Gospels were consistent with each other, proving that they are not lies and proving that Jesus truly existed and was God. But in this part I'll be going over the bias test, which is used to see if the Gospel writers had any bias in their writing. Of course the Gospel writers really loved Jesus and were for him, causing some people to believe that they may have exaggerated some details showing their bias. Fortunately though, this doesn't really make sense in any context. The people who wrote the Gospels were Christians, meaning that they were followers of Christ or mini Christ. See, when you become a Christian, you are to live like Christ. You need to repent of your sins. So Christians are honest people because lying is a sin. So if you take this into context, you can see that the writers had a priority in honesty describing the life of Jesus and not showing any bias. For example, they all included things about Jesus that may not have been beneficial, like spitting, mocking, and beating of Jesus. Nobody with bias would make up a religion and have their God humiliated and killed. So we know that the Gospel writers didn't use any personal bias in their writings. In part 11, I'll be going over the cover-up test, so please. Part 11 of proving Jesus existed. In part 10 I talked about the Gospel writers not having any biased intentions in their writing, proving that history was accurately represented and that Jesus truly existed. In this part, I'll talk about the cover-up test. Did the Gospel writers leave out embarrassing details about Jesus? Because if everything in the Gospels writes so much positive things about Jesus, doesn't it mean that a lot of stuff was covered up and perhaps made up? Well, first of all, there are quite a few so-called embarrassing details. For example, it is recorded that Jesus could not do any miracles in Nazareth. And keep in mind, miracles were an important part in proving that Jesus was the Messiah. Also, it is recorded that Jesus does not know when his second coming is, seeming to limit his omniscience. Same things with Jesus being baptized, although baptism is for sinners, and Jesus being mocked, tortured, and spat on the cross. I don't know about you, but if I was making up a religion that I wanted people to actually follow, I would not include these things as part of the story. There's also many embarrassing details about the disciples, who were the first missionaries, showing that there was no cover-up at all. Check out part 12 to see whether the Gospels pass the corroboration test or not. Part 12 of proving Jesus existed. In part 11, I explained how the Gospel writers didn't conceal parts of Jesus' life, but in fact showed all sides to the story, further proving that it was not made up and that Jesus truly existed. In this part, we will be looking at the corroboration test. The Gospels mention certain people, places, objects, and events, but were these actually real? Because if they were made up, then the Gospel writers were liars and Jesus didn't exist either. Well, archaeology and non-Christian historians tell us that many of these biblical places did exist, and there is non-biblical historical records of certain biblical events. After all, you can go to Israel and check out all the biblical places right now. If Jesus was truly a made-up person, how do you think people haven't used historical sites in Israel to prove that he's made up? So far, no one has been able to give proper proof that Jesus never existed. It's absurd to say that he was made up considering the many historical sites are still preserved today, and Jesus' impact is still there today. I will go into the specifics of these examples in a later part, but for now, check out part 13. I'll be talking about the witness test. Part 13 of proving Jesus existed. In part 12, I talked about the many events, people, and places in the Gospels occurring at specific times in history, therefore removing the possibility that Jesus developed as a legend. In this part, I'll be talking about the witness test. For almost every Gospel event, there is always a skeptic present to witness. So if Jesus was made up or if the Gospels were corrupt, then these witnesses could easily take the opportunity to discredit the Gospels and shut down Christianity. But Jewish writings never denied Jesus existed, nor did they discredit his miracles. In fact, they say that Jesus was a sorcerer who led Israel away. I'm not saying all Jews believe this, but some Jewish writings were found. Also keep in mind that biblical and non-biblical history records apostles preaching the gospel within months of the resurrection, but they were never disagreed with other than the fact that Jesus was God and that he resurrected. Other than that, Pharisees had no problems with anything else, proving that a man named Jesus had existed, performed miracles, and even was crucified. In part 14, I'll be talking about how the Bible passes the bibliographical test. Part 14 of proving Jesus existed. The main sources we have about Jesus are the Gospels, so if those sources are not true, then Jesus never existed, which is why for the past few parts of the series I've gone over many tests and showed that the Gospels pass all of them. But there's one final test called the bibliographical test, which looks at the amount of copies made and how close they were made to the original event. So if a book actually passes this test, then we know that it's not corrupted and it can actually be trusted. And the New Testament actually passes the test more than any other historical doc ever, making it the most preserved. As of 2010, a total of 5,838 original Greek copies of the New Testament were found. Keep in mind that the New Testament was written in Greek, and because the New Testament was written in Greek, these are exact copies with no meaning-changing variances. To put that into perspective, Homer's Iliad only has 1,800 copies, and the earliest original copy of the New Testament was only made a little less than 30 years after it was written. Compare this to the Quran, which has less than half the number of copies of the New Testament, and has the earliest being 40 to 50 years after it was written. The New Testament, according to history and stats, is the best preserved doc in all of history. Part 15 of proving Jesus existed. In part 14, I talked about how the Bible passes the bibliographical test with flying colors, literally making it one of the most preserved books in all of history. But there are many documents that were not included in the final collection called the Bible. These documents were called the Apocrypha and were thrown out. But doesn't this make the Bible corrupt and unreliable? What documents can we actually trust? Actually, by not including these books, the Bible is more reliable, because the reason the books were not included was because they were unreliable, uninspired, and works of fiction. The books that were included in the Bible, especially in the New Testament, had thousands of original copies with no meaning-changing variances. I talked about this in the last part, but thousands of copies with no variances show how reliable and uncorrupt the docs are. But the books that were not included did not have the same amount of copies, nor were they written at a reasonable time. The Gospel of Thomas, for example, represents Jesus in a way neither biblical writers nor non-biblical writers talk about him. Also, I recommend you read it. It literally makes no sense at all. But what about non-biblical sources about Jesus? I'll talk about that in part 16. Part 16 of proving Jesus existed. In part 15, I talked about what the criteria for the books included in the Bible was. I explained why the only most reliable books were chosen, because Christians wanted the most accurate info. But there's also many non-biblical sources like Roman historian Tacitus and the Jewish historian Josephus. Josephus actually wrote a lot about John the Baptist because he had more political influence, but the existence of John the Baptist proves the existence of Jesus, as John had been preaching about Jesus. As for Tacitus, he wrote a lot about Christians and how they were killed by Nero. And the interesting thing is that Tacitus also writes about Jesus' trial and execution. He even mentions Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman that gave the final orders for Jesus' execution. He also indirectly mentions the resurrection. He says Pontius Pilate was able to have the so-called mischief checked for a bit, but then it broke out again. And the Bible tells us that when Jesus was crucified, the disciples and his followers scattered everywhere because they didn't want to be killed. But then after the resurrection, they began to preach the good news together. Pliny the Younger also wrote about early Christians in 100 AD and how they believed that Jesus was God. In part 17, I'll be talking about the proof for the existence of Pontius Pilate. Part 17 of proving Jesus existed. In part 16, I talked about the non-biblical sources for Jesus like Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger. Pliny wrote about Christians in 100 AD and how they believed that Jesus was God and how they were very strong in faith. Well, many people claim that Jesus never existed and that he developed as a legend, but 20 to 50 years isn't enough time for a legend to develop. In this part, I'll be going over the proof for Pontius Pilate. In the last part, I talked about how Tacitus wrote about Pontius Pilate, the person who ordered Jesus' crucifixion. Many other historians write about him as well, but they describe him as an obstinate and inflexible person. But the Bible describes him as a flexible person and not wanting to crucify Jesus. In the end, he was actually forced by the Jews, so he changed his mind. Some people use this to say that the Bible contradicts other history and is wrong. Not so fast. Jesus' crucifixion, according to history, occurred in about 33 AD, and Pilate's patron, Sejanus, was removed from power by the emperor in 31 AD, making Pilate's position very weak. In this weak state, Pilate's main goal was to keep the Jews under control and prevent an uprising by giving Jews whatever they wanted. In this case, the Jews wanted Jesus' crucifixion, so it explains why Pilate had changed his mind. Part 18 of proving Jesus existed. In part 17, I talked about the evidence for Pontius Pilate. This is because Pontius Pilate was mentioned in all 4 Gospels, and if he never existed, then it means the Gospel writers are liars and Jesus never existed either. In this part, I'll be going over the accuracy for the Gospel of Luke, as Luke claims that he has done extensive research and has reviewed with many eyewitnesses before releasing his book. In Luke 3:1, he refers to someone named Lysanias as the Tetrarch of Abilene in AD 27. Many threw away this Gospel because Lysanias was actually the ruler of Chalcis 50 years earlier. But then an inscription was found from about AD 30, and it said that Lysanias was the Tetrarch of Abilene. Accusations against Luke's accuracy as a historian have always ended up being proved wrong through history and archaeology. Luke was definitely an accurate historian, as he proved the claim that he made in Luke 1 that he did all his research and only wrote down the facts and evidence. Go check out part 19 for the reliability of the Gospels of John and Mark. Part 19 of proving Jesus existed. In part 18, I talked about the accuracy of the Gospel of Luke because Luke claims that he has done a lot of research before releasing his account. In this part, we will be looking at the reliability for the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Mark. But John and Mark often mention certain places that can't be verified that well, making them kinda sus by bringing up the possibility that they have not represented Jesus accurately. John 1:5-15 is of Jesus healing a person at the pool of Bethesda, which had 5 porticos. Many people had no idea where this was, so they assumed that John was lying. But recently, the pool of Bethesda has been excavated by archaeologists, and just as John had described, it had 5 porticos. Some other important places that were discovered are the Pool of Siloam, Jacob's Well, and the Jaffa Gate. Mark says that in 731 that Jesus traveled down to the Sea of Galilee to Decapolis. But some argue that Mark is ignorant because in context Jesus would have traveled away from the Sea of Galilee to Decapolis. But what they fail to understand is that there's no highways nor paved roads back then. Decapolis was actually a confederation of 10 cities, and there's a lot of probable roads in the huge region, allowing for a path to be made in which Jesus would go down to the Sea of Galilee. Part 20 of proving Jesus existed. In part 19, I went over the reliability of the Gospel of John and the Gospel of Mark. This is because if the Gospels are not reliable, then what they say about Jesus isn't reliable either, meaning that Jesus most likely did not exist. In this part, I'll be going over a very important story about Jesus' birth. Both Matthew and Luke recorded census taking place before Jesus' birth, causing Mary and Joseph to go to Bethlehem, where Jesus is born. But did this census really happen? Some find it strange that the ruler ordered all citizens to travel to their hometown to be counted, in this case Bethlehem. They argue that this is unreasonable, therefore Mary and Joseph never did this and Jesus never existed. Not so fast. There's evidence from multiple census forms that this is actually how they took place. A form from AD 104 in Egypt is of a ruler ordering his citizens to go back to their birthplace to be counted for a census. See, it's not really a strange practice at all, so we know that the census of Jesus' birth actually happened. This means that the Gospel writers are not liars and that Jesus existed. In part 21, I'll be going over the existence of Nazareth, Jesus' hometown. Part 21 of Proving Jesus Existed. In part 20, I went over the census of Jesus' birth as it is a very important event. If it didn't happen, that means the gospel writers are liars. But I proved how the census did happen, and in this part I'll be talking about the existence of Nazareth, the town in which Jesus grew up. Some argue Nazareth never existed, which if true means that the gospels are a lie. This is because it is not mentioned by most non-biblical historians who mention Jesus, and it isn't even mentioned by Paul. But Nazareth did exist. Archaeologists in 1962 found an Aramaic list of 24 priest families who relocated after the second destruction of Jerusalem's temple in AD 70, and evidence shows that they relocated to a town called Nazareth. Also, many tombs were found near the Nazareth area, proving that there was a town. In fact, the Nazareth Archaeological Project started excavations in 2006 and found doors, windows, cooking pottery, and even part of a house. Anyways, the existence of Nazareth has not been an issue for a long time as there is so much physical proof for it, and because of this, whenever someone says Nazareth never existed, the burden of proof is on them. In other words, you don't need to find all the proof that Nazareth exists. Instead, they have to provide the proof that Nazareth doesn't exist. Part 22 of Proving Jesus Existed. In part 21, I went over the existence of Nazareth, Jesus' hometown. I proved that Nazareth was a real place, because if it wasn't, then the Gospels were wrong and Jesus never existed. In this part, I'll be going over the slaughter in Bethlehem. Soon after Jesus' birth, the Bible says that King Herod ordered many children to be slaughtered in Bethlehem because he wanted to get rid of Jesus. But did this slaughter ever happen? Almost no historian ever mentions such a mass murder happening. Well, first of all, we have to know that Bethlehem was a very small town, about the size of Nazareth, so the number of kids who were slaughtered were very few. So killing of a few children won't really be that much of attention to the people under Roman rule. Now, I know this sounds insensitive considering the media coverage we have today, but you have to understand that King Herod was a very evil person as he killed many of his own family members to protect his throne. With this knowledge, it makes sense why the slaughter didn't get much attention. But Christians know this slaughter was important for the credibility of the Bible, as it was actually prophesied about in the Old Testament. You can learn about that in my series Fulfilled Bible Prophecies. Anyways, in the next part I'll be talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, so please go check that out. Part 23 of Proving Jesus Existed. For the last few parts, I covered some important events recorded in the Gospels and proved that they actually happened. This is because I was trying to prove the reliability of the New Testament so that we know that Jesus truly existed. But there's also prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament, and the Old Testament is actually also reliable as proved through the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are hundreds of manuscripts dating from 250 BC to AD 68. They were found in 1947 near Jerusalem, and they were complete collections of all the Old Testament books except for the Book of Esther. And these scrolls, directly translated, have the same meaning as the Bibles that we have today. This shows that the Bible has not been changed over time and hadn't been corrupted. These Dead Sea Scrolls were hidden by the Essenes Jews and stayed hidden for thousands of years as the Bible manuscripts were copied and compiled. Many people claim that these copies distorted the Bible and corrupted it. If that's true, then the Bible we have today should be different in meaning from the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it isn't. You can actually check out the Dead Sea Scrolls for yourself online for free. In part 24, I'll be talking about the possibility of miracles, as Jesus did a lot of them, so make sure to go check that out. Part 24 of Proving Jesus Existed. In part 23, I talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls and explained how they proved the reliability of the Old Testament, and before that I went over the reliability of the New Testament. So we know that we have a reliable Bible with many sources about Jesus, as well as many reliable non-biblical sources by many famous historians. All of these sources prove that Jesus existed. But what about Jesus' miracles? And what about the biggest miracle of the resurrection? Some people argue that miracles are not possible and therefore Jesus is made of fairy tale. Of course, for the past 23 parts I've been going over the historical, archaeological, and logical proof of the existence of Jesus, but I want to finish off with one of the first things people have against Jesus. Many people say the probability of a miracle happening is very low, but a probability is based on a repeated event in the same conditions. But with a miracle, we cannot repeat it in the same conditions and get a probability. Therefore, probability has nothing to do with the possibility of miracles. Also, so many people from all over the world testify that miracles happen to them. Is it just a coincidence every time? Is there a more probability that these miracles are coincidence, or a more probability that these miracles are actually miracles? Clearly, miracles are possible, and in part 25 I'll be talking about why all this even matters. Part 25 of Proving Jesus Existed. This is the last part. For the past 24 videos, I've been going over the historical sources about Jesus and showing how these sources are accurate by testing them. So we know that Jesus truly existed. But so what? How does Jesus' existence change the way you live? Well, Jesus existed, and he also claimed to be God, and he backed that claim up by dying on the cross and then resurrecting 3 days later. So if Jesus is God, then whatever he says must be true. This means that we're all guilty sinners heading towards hell, but we can trust Jesus' sacrifice on the cross and his gift for us. We can trust him and repent our sin and then be able to go to heaven. But did Jesus really claim to be God? Many people like Muslims will argue that he did not claim to be God. And it's fine if you don't trust me that Jesus claimed to be God, because I'm going to be releasing a series on November 7th called Did Jesus Claim to be God? I'll be releasing a more in-depth conclusion video tomorrow, so make sure to stick around for that as well. And also follow my account so you can watch the next series. Stay strong and never sin again.